A reservoir that once held thousands of acre-feet of water now sits exposed under an open sky, its basin reduced to cracked sediment and scattered remnants of what used to be a steady inland shoreline. How does a body of water spanning roughly 700 acres vanish so completely? What chain of conditions could strip away a reservoir that, at its fullest, typically reaches depths of about 25 feet, or roughly 7.6 meters? And more importantly, is this an isolated event tied to one unusual season, or part of a pattern that is becoming harder to ignore across the American West? In southeastern Colorado, the drying of Two Buttes Reservoir has drawn attention not because it is entirely unprecedented, but because of how decisively and completely it occurred following a winter that failed to deliver the moisture the region depends on. The reservoir, which lies in a semi-arid landscape already accustomed to fluctuations in water availability, has historically experienced periods of decline. However, the current situation stands out for the speed and extent of the loss, leaving behind a basin that now bears little resemblance to the water body it once was. Two Buttes Reservoir spans an area of about 700 acres when conditions allow it to fill. That translates to approximately 283 hectares, a footprint large enough to support recreation, local ecosystems, and water storage needs. Under typical circumstances, the reservoir reaches a maximum depth of about 25 feet, equivalent to around 7.6 meters, holding a substantial volume of water relative to its size. This volume is not just a static feature, it represents a balance between inflow and outflow, precipitation and evaporation, supply and demand. The recent drying of the reservoir can be traced back to a combination of factors, with the most immediate being a warm and notably dry winter season. Winter precipitation plays a crucial role in replenishing reservoirs across Colorado, particularly through snowfall that accumulates in higher elevations. This snowpack acts as a natural reservoir in its own right, slowly melting as temperatures rise and feeding rivers, streams, and ultimately reservoirs downstream. When that snowpack is reduced, the cascading effect becomes evident months later. In the case of southeastern Colorado, the winter delivered less snow and rain than expected. The absence of sufficient snowfall meant that the spring melt, which typically contributes to rising water levels, was significantly diminished. Without that influx, the reservoir began the year already at a deficit. Compounding this issue was the presence of warmer than average temperatures, which accelerated evaporation rates and reduced the efficiency of whatever limited inflow remained. Evaporation is often an underestimated factor in reservoir management, especially in regions where temperatures can fluctuate widely. As air temperatures rise, the rate at which water transitions from liquid to vapor increases. In a shallow reservoir where the surface area is relatively large compared to its depth, this process can lead to rapid water loss. A depth of 25 feet or 7.6 meters might seem substantial, but when spread across 700 acres, the exposure to sun and wind becomes a critical variable. Wind, too, plays a role in this process. Southeastern Colorado is no stranger to strong, persistent winds, which can enhance evaporation by continually moving air across the water's surface. This movement prevents the formation of a humid layer above the water that would otherwise slow evaporation. Instead, dry air is constantly introduced, allowing more water to escape into the atmosphere. Another contributing factor lies in the broader hydrological context of the region. Reservoirs do not exist in isolation. They are part of interconnected systems that include upstream sources, groundwater interactions, and human-managed diversions. When upstream flows are reduced, whether due to lower precipitation or increased usage elsewhere, downstream reservoirs like Two Buttes receive less input. This reduction can be gradual or abrupt, depending on the conditions, but the outcome is the same: declining water levels. The role of soil conditions also becomes apparent in such scenarios. After extended periods of dryness, the ground surrounding and beneath a reservoir can become more absorbent. When water levels begin to drop, some of the remaining water may seep into the subsurface rather than staying contained. This infiltration is not necessarily visible, but it contributes to the overall loss. Over time, repeated cycles of drying can alter the permeability of the reservoir bed, influencing how water is retained or lost during future refilling attempts. Historical patterns indicate that Two Buttes Reservoir has dried out before, suggesting that its current state is not entirely without precedent. However, past occurrences often involved more gradual declines or partial drying rather than the complete absence of standing water now observed. Typically, even during lower periods, some portion of the reservoir would remain, providing at least a minimal buffer against total depletion. What distinguishes the present situation is the convergence of multiple stressors within a relatively short time frame. A winter lacking in precipitation set the stage, followed by conditions that amplified water loss rather than mitigating it. The absence of significant inflow meant there was little opportunity for recovery, and the reservoir's natural vulnerabilities, its shallow depth, broad surface area, and exposure to environmental factors, became increasingly apparent. The implications of a dried reservoir extend beyond its immediate boundaries. For local ecosystems, the loss of a water body of this size disrupts habitats that depend on its presence. Aquatic species, birds, and other wildlife that rely on the reservoir for food, shelter, or migration stopovers are forced to adapt or relocate. The exposed basin, once submerged, may temporarily support different forms of life, but the transition is neither immediate nor seamless. From a land management perspective, the drying also raises questions about sediment exposure and long-term maintenance. When water recedes, it leaves behind layers of sediment that can become compacted, eroded, or redistributed by wind. Over time, these changes can alter the reservoir's capacity to hold water when conditions improve. Sediment accumulation may reduce depth, while erosion can reshape the basin's contours, affecting how water is stored and retained. Recreational use is another dimension affected by the reservoir's disappearance. Areas that once supported boating, fishing, and other activities become inaccessible or fundamentally altered. Infrastructure built to accommodate these uses, such as boat ramps or docks, may be rendered unusable, at least temporarily. While such impacts may not be the primary concern in a broader environmental context, they contribute to the overall significance of the event for the surrounding region. Water management strategies are also brought into sharper focus under these conditions. Reservoirs like Two Buttes are often part of a network designed to balance supply and demand across varying conditions. When one component of that network fails to perform as expected, it can place additional pressure on others. This redistribution of demand may not always be visible, but it influences decisions related to allocation, conservation, and future planning. The timing of the drying is particularly notable. Occurring after winter, a season typically associated with accumulation rather than depletion, it underscores the importance of seasonal cycles in maintaining water systems. A single season's deviation from expected patterns can have repercussions that extend well into the following months, shaping conditions in ways that are not easily reversed. Temperature trends during the winter also played a role beyond simply reducing snowfall. Warmer conditions can lead to precipitation falling as rain rather than snow, especially at elevations where the distinction between the two is marginal. Rain does not provide the same delayed release benefit as snowpack. It either runs off quickly or evaporates, offering limited contribution to sustained water supply. This shift in precipitation type further reduces the effectiveness of winter as a replenishment period. As spring transitions into summer, the absence of water in the reservoir becomes more pronounced. Without significant inflow, the likelihood of natural refilling diminishes, especially if conditions remain dry. Even if precipitation increases later in the year, the time required to restore a reservoir of this size to its typical depth can be substantial, depending on the intensity and duration of rainfall events. The broader climatic context cannot be ignored when examining events like this. Variability in precipitation and temperature is a defining feature of the region, but the frequency and intensity of deviations appear to be shifting. Periods of drought, once considered intermittent, may be occurring more frequently or lasting longer, while wet periods may not fully compensate for the deficits created during dry spells. As attention shifts from the immediate conditions that led to the reservoir's disappearance, the underlying geology of southeastern Colorado begins to explain why a water body like Two Buttes Reservoir is particularly vulnerable to dramatic fluctuations. The region sits within the western portion of the Great Plains, an area defined not by steep mountain gradients but by broad, gently sloping terrain, underlain by layers of sedimentary rock, ancient river deposits and wind-blown materials that have accumulated over millions of years. This geologic foundation influences how water moves, how it is stored, and how quickly it can be lost once surface conditions change. Beneath the reservoir basin, the subsurface is composed largely of unconsolidated and semi-consolidated sediments, including sand, silt, clay, and gravel. These materials vary in their ability to hold and transmit water. Coarser materials such as sand and gravel tend to allow water to move more freely, while finer materials like clay can restrict flow but also create zones where water becomes perched or temporarily stored. The arrangement of these layers is not uniform, meaning that some portions of the reservoir bed may retain water more effectively than others, while certain areas may facilitate seepage into deeper ground layers. When the reservoir is full, the weight of the water column exerts pressure on the underlying sediments, helping to keep finer particles compacted and reducing permeability at the surface. However, as water levels drop, that pressure diminishes. The exposed sediments begin to dry, shrink and crack, a process that can increase permeability. Once cracks form, they create pathways that allow remaining water to infiltrate downward more efficiently. This transition can accelerate the final stages of drying, turning what might have been a gradual decline into a more abrupt disappearance of standing water. Groundwater interactions also play a subtle but important role. In some regions, reservoirs are closely connected to groundwater systems, either gaining water from them or losing water into them, depending on relative levels. In southeastern Colorado, groundwater conditions can vary significantly over short distances. If the water table lies below the base of the reservoir effectively becomes a source of recharge, with water seeping downward into the aquifer. During periods of low inflow, this downward movement can continue even as surface levels decline, contributing to the overall loss. The climate of the region amplifies these geological tendencies. Southeastern Colorado experiences a semi-arid climate characterized by relatively low annual precipitation and high variability from year to year. Average precipitation levels are often insufficient to maintain large bodies of water without consistent seasonal input. This makes reservoirs highly dependent on episodic events such as winter snowfall or intense summer storms. When those events fail to materialize, the balance shifts quickly toward deficit. Temperature patterns further complicate the situation. Warmer conditions not only increase evaporation rates but also influence soil moisture dynamics. Dry soils can become hydrophobic under certain conditions, initially resisting water infiltration when rain does occur. However, once that threshold is overcome, infiltration can proceed rapidly, drawing water away from the surface. This dual behavior means that even when precipitation returns, it does not always translate into efficient reservoir refilling. Wind erosion becomes a visible process once the reservoir basin is exposed. Fine sediments that were once settled underwater are now subject to transport by strong regional winds. Over time, this can lead to the redistribution of material across the basin and beyond, subtly altering the topography. The removal of fine particles may leave behind coarser substrates that have different hydraulic properties, potentially affecting how water spreads and pools when it eventually returns. Another factor tied to the region's geology is the presence of natural drainage patterns that predate the reservoir itself. Many reservoirs are constructed in areas where water naturally collects, often by damming a stream or low-lying basin. However, these natural systems continue to exert influence. Channels that once directed water into the basin can also facilitate its exit when levels drop. As water recedes, it may follow these earlier pathways, concentrating flow and enhancing localized erosion, which can deepen channels and make it easier for future water to drain away rather than accumulate. Salt and mineral content within the soil also become more pronounced as water evaporates. When a reservoir holds water, dissolved minerals remain diluted. As evaporation progresses, these minerals become concentrated and can eventually precipitate out, forming crusts on the surface. This process not only changes the chemical composition of the remaining water, but also affects the physical properties of the soil. Salt crusts can reduce infiltration in some cases, but they can also create brittle surfaces that break apart under stress, contributing to further fragmentation of the basin floor. The interplay between evaporation and infiltration is central to understanding why the reservoir did not simply shrink, but instead disappeared entirely. In a more humid environment, reduced water levels might stabilize at a lower equilibrium, supported by ongoing inflow and limited evaporation. In southeastern Colorado, however, evaporation rates can exceed precipitation for extended periods. When combined with infiltration into permeable sediments, the system effectively loses water from both the surface and below, leaving little opportunity for stabilization. Seasonal timing remains critical in this process. The absence of sufficient winter precipitation meant that the reservoir entered the warmer months already depleted. As spring temperatures rose, evaporation intensified at a time when inflow should have been increasing. This mismatch between expected supply and actual conditions created a feedback loop in which declining water levels exposed more surface area, which in turn accelerated evaporation. The shallower the water became, the faster it warmed, further increasing the rate at which it was lost to the atmosphere. Looking at longer-term patterns, the region has experienced cycles of wet and dry periods that influence reservoir behavior. However, recent trends suggest that warm periods are becoming more pronounced, and precipitation is not always arriving in forms that effectively replenish storage systems. Short, intense rainfall events can produce runoff, but without sustained input, they do not compensate for prolonged deficits. Moreover, rapid runoff can bypass reservoirs if the timing and intensity do not align with the system's capacity to capture and retain water. Human management practices, while not the primary focus, intersect with these natural processes. Reservoirs are often operated with specific objectives in mind, including irrigation support, wildlife habitat, and recreation. Water levels may be intentionally drawn down at certain times of the year, which can leave them more vulnerable if replenishment does not occur as expected. In a year with limited precipitation, even routine management actions can contribute to a situation where recovery becomes increasingly difficult. The structural design of the reservoir also plays a role. With a relatively shallow maximum depth of about 25 feet or roughly 7.6 meters, the ratio of surface area to volume is high. This means that a significant portion of the water is always near the surface, where it is most susceptible to evaporation. Deeper reservoirs, by contrast, can retain a larger proportion of their water below the surface, where temperatures are cooler and evaporation is less direct. In Two Buttes Reservoir, the geometry itself makes it inherently more sensitive to climatic stress. As the basin remains dry, biological processes begin to adapt to the new conditions. Microorganisms that thrive in moist environments give way to those suited for arid soil. Vegetation may begin to colonize the dry surface, particularly along the margins where moisture lingers longest. These changes, while subtle at first, can influence how the basin responds when water returns. Root systems can stabilize sediments, but they can also alter permeability and water distribution, creating a different set of conditions than those that existed before the drying event. Dust generation becomes another consequence of prolonged exposure. Fine particles lifted by wind can travel significant distances, contributing to regional air quality issues and depositing material elsewhere. This loss of fine sediment from the basin not only changes its composition, but may also reduce its capacity to retain water in the future, as finer materials are often more effective at limiting seepage compared to coarser remnants. The broader hydrologic network continues to evolve in response to these localized changes. Streams that feed into the reservoir may experience altered flow patterns, particularly if upstream conditions mirror those at the reservoir site. Reduced vegetation cover, changes in soil moisture, and shifting precipitation patterns all influence how water moves across the landscape. Over time, these adjustments can either support or hinder the refilling of the reservoir, depending on how they align with future weather conditions. In considering what lies ahead, the key variables remain precipitation, temperature, and the timing of both. A return of substantial winter snowfall, followed by a gradual and sustained melt, would provide the most effective pathway toward refilling. However, even under favorable conditions, the altered state of the basin may influence how quickly and efficiently water accumulates. Cracked sediments, redistributed materials, and changes in surface characteristics all play a role in determining the pace of recovery. For now, the empty basin of Two Buttes Reservoir reflects a convergence of geological and climatic processes that have aligned in a way that favors loss over retention. The ground beneath, shaped over vast time scales, interacts with present-day conditions in ways that are not always immediately visible, but are nonetheless decisive. Water, when present, masks many of these dynamics. Its absence reveals them, offering a clearer view of how delicate the balance can be in regions where supply is never guaranteed. If you found this breakdown insightful and want more deep dives into real-world events like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Do not forget to tap that hype icon so this video can reach a wider audience, and keep these kinds of detailed reports coming your way.